Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 41 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and relevant information that pilots can use. Now, last week in episode 40, I talked about the dangers of flying too close to the ground, and we talked about a couple of fatal accidents in which aircraft were purposely flying close to the ground for fun and died. Well, just 24 hours after that episode was released, 40-year-old retired Major League Baseball pitcher Roy Halladay died in the Gulf of Mexico in his Icon A5. While we don't know the cause of that accident, we do know that he was doing lots of low-level maneuvering over the water. And later in the show, I'll talk about Icon accidents, give you details from the Icon A5 POH, talk about its safety features, how it's marketed, and what it all means. But first, coming up in the news, an FAA controller, believe it or not, has been arrested and charged with possession of a weapon of mass destruction. And China just bought another American aviation company, and we'll tell you which one. And pilots in Australia and New Zealand stand to benefit from a current test being run in those countries for cattle farmers. And another country has just announced that women will finally be allowed to learn to fly in that country. And to wrap it up, we have a story about pilots and turtles. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott. I'm here to educate and inform you as a pilot or student pilot, and hopefully have a little fun in the process. Along the way, I'll share my 40 years of experience as a certificated pilot, author of the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook and some other books, and as the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year, and of course a specialist in Cirrus aircraft like the SR20 and SR22. Now, last week in our Accident Corner feature, we talked about recent GA accidents involving aircraft maneuvering at low altitude. If you missed that show, you'll want to check out episode 40. This week, we have lots to share with you, and it all begins now. From Plane and Pilot magazine, flying car maker Terrafugia has been acquired by a Chinese company. Well, there were rumors about this that started this past summer, and it's been confirmed now that Terrafugia has been purchased by Zhejiang Geely Holding Company. Now, the Geely Holding is a China-based automotive manufacturing company that includes brands like Lotus and Volvo. According to Terrafugia, the company will remain based here in the United States. Now, Terrafugia was founded back in 2006 by co-founders Dr. Carl Dietrich and his wife Anna, both of whom I've talked to multiple times in the past. Wonderful people. Of the multiple flying car models currently under development, this is according to Plane and Pilot, the Terrafugia Transition is probably the closest to FAA approval. They received their LSA certification exemption for an increased weight and stall speed back in June of 2016. And by the way, Terrafugia likes to refer to that vehicle as a roadable aircraft. I know they try and avoid the flying car name, which is often thrown about in the media. Now, that prototype has logged more than 100 flight hours, and Terrafugia says it still plans on beginning deliveries of it in 2019. The company is aiming to make its other flying car project, the VTOL-capable TFX, available by 2023. The TFX is a plug-in hybrid tilt-rotor vehicle that should be one of the first autonomous flying cars, and it has a range of 500 miles per flight, and the batteries are rechargeable by the engine. And Carl, I still want to be one of the first people to fly the Transition when you finally let people in the media test it out. I'm looking forward to that. Should be great fun. And our next story comes from the GephardtDaily.com. Charlotte police say that an air traffic controller has been arrested for a weapon of mass destruction. Very odd story, but according to it, Paul George Dandin, 30 years old, was charged with possession of a weapon of mass destruction, acquiring a weapon of mass destruction, and transporting it. He's being held on $45,000 bond, which sounds pretty low to me, by the way. Authorities also arrested Derek Fells, 39, who built the bomb to, quote, use it against a neighbor with whom he was involved in an ongoing dispute, according to investigators. Instead, apparently, he changed his mind and gave the bomb to Dandin. Now, WCNC-TV reports that the two men are roommates, though I think they could be cellmates in the future. The FAA says that Dandin's access to the airport was terminated. Also, it should be noted back in March of 2015, Dandin was arrested and charged with assault on a female. And according to NPR, a large portion of the mass shootings in the U.S. in recent years have roots in domestic violence against partners and family members. So it's kind of an interesting connection here in this story as well, too. This next story was just sent to me by a friend in the FAA, and the story was written by John Croft, also of the FAA. It says, new weather technology is helping forecasters in Puerto Rico. Now, we've talked about Hurricane Maria multiple times and its impact on Puerto Rico. One of those impacts was it knocked out the NEXRAD weather radar there. And so now forecasters have turned to an FAA web-based prototype weather analysis tool as kind of a surrogate for radar. It's called the Offshore Precipitation Capability, or OPC, and it was developed by the FAA and MIT's Lincoln Laboratory to give controllers, airline dispatchers, and planners a view of the internal makeup of weather systems over the oceans where NEXRAD radar is not available. But the National Weather Service forecasters in San Juan have been using OPC in combination with other satellite-based and ground sensor systems to issue weather advisories and warnings to the population until that NEXRAD system there gets replaced. Now, NEXRAD radar provides FAA controllers with 6 color-coded levels of precipitation intensity, and that's based on radar echoes that come back from the clouds. By contrast, OPC estimates the precipitation location and intensity of storms outside of radar coverage by using machine learning techniques and data from nearby NEXRAD sites, plus visual and infrared imagery from weather satellites and global lightning detection systems. Now, one of the staff members says that the models are made by analyzing huge volumes of historical data from radar and non-radar sources and identifying links between the two. Now, along with a snapshot of current weather conditions, OPC might in the future be able to create a 12-hour forecast as well. Some drawbacks on using this is that there is uncertainty in the precise location and intensity of the precipitations, but air traffic controllers say that operationally it's accurate enough to help, and it's a major upgrade to what they had before to watch oceanic storms, which was just satellite imagery of clouds. Another staffer said that while not as granular, the information is nonetheless important in an area where we don't have anything. It's huge. So that's a fascinating new technology that's making a difference. Speaking of technology from Garmin, we've talked in the past about the visual approach guidance that's available in the Cirrus Perspective. It's now available in the GTN series, the 650 and 750 navigators. The new capability provides advisory vertical guidance in VFR conditions based on a published glide slope angle or a 3-degree glide slope from the threshold of the runway while considering terrain and obstacle clearance. When selecting a visual approach, pilots can choose the runway they want to land on and either select vectors or have it set up a 5-mile final to the airport. Now, I have flown with this in the Cirrus. It is really cool to watch this basically create a path to the airport as well as the descent profile. So I really love it. And from AOPA, if you're a pilot at least once in your career, you have taken one of the written exams, which are now given online. Well, AOPA is seeking comments from pilots about the knowledge testing process because the FAA is requesting bids on a new 3-year contract, and AOPA wants to provide input to them. And so there's a 1-question survey where you can share your experiences about the knowledge testing process and any changes that you think should be made. AOPA will then use this member feedback to help evaluate the contract the FAA plans to award. Now, the current service provider, PSA, delivers tests through sites that include flight schools and FBOs. Currently, the test fees range from about $140 to $165, depending upon the location, with a large portion of that fee being shared with the flight schools and FBOs. By the way, PSA recently merged with the only other FAA-authorized test provider, Computer-Aided Testing Service, or CATS. In 2016, 109,000 traditional FAA exams were delivered, and 16,000 UAV knowledge exams were delivered. And I'll include a link to that survey in our show notes and also on the Patreon site. In international news, cattle farmers are kicking off a 2-year Australia-New Zealand SBAS trial. What's SBAS? Well, that's Satellite-Based Augmentation System, SBAS. And that trial is going to be going on in Queensland in this new test. Commonwealth announced a 2-year project to test out SBAS. And if you're not familiar with it, that's what's used here in the United States to create higher accuracy WAAS-based instrument approaches. So without SBAS, we wouldn't be able to fly things like LPVs. We'd be stuck with the old traditional non-precision GPS approaches. This project aims to improve the accuracy, integrity, and availability of signals currently provided by the GPS system. CQ University is testing how SBAS will offer navigational accuracy of around 10 centimeters, which is about, 4 inches, in the horizontal plane that could improve cattle and sheep farm outputs in the agricultural industry. The university said more accurately tracking the movement of cattle, sheep, and other livestock would help with early disease detection and more efficient breeding programs. So why are we talking about that, you might ask? Well, according to Lockheed Martin Australia Managing Director for Space, Rod Drury, he said the promised accuracy of SBAS has a number of applications in aviation, and not just the promise of cost-effective, highly accurate precision approaches for airports large and small, but also for increasing airport capability. So it sounds like WASP-based GPS approaches may be headed to countries down under in the future, which is great. And from the SaudiGazette.com.sa, this was announced at the Dubai Air Show this week, the Oxford Aviation Academy branch in Dammam is going to be training women pilots. Well, what's the big deal, you say? You may not be aware, but Saudi Arabia was one of the last countries to just recently allow women to start driving. Sounds like they're also going to let them fly as well. According to one of the Academy's directors, he said that women will be trained to become pilots flying commercially and in other aviation fields as equally as men. They're going to open this new branch of the Academy on January 1st, 2018. They say the requirements for applying are the same for men and women, and they say that they adhere to the standards of the General Authority for Civil Aviation. By the way, only 40% of pilots in the Saudi job market are Saudi, and only 2 of them are women. He says we aspire to have 60,000 pilots and technicians over the next 20 years. And by the way, I read recently about the first woman Saudi commercial airline pilot. She had to go to Jordan to get her flight training, but now in the future, that can be done in Saudi Arabia. And finally, we have this story from AvWeb. A lot of pilots look for ways that they can use their piloting skills to help others. Well, here's a way you can help turtles. Hundreds of endangered and threatened turtles wash up every year along the beaches of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and they're stunned by the cold waters and in need of medical care to survive. For the last few years, GA pilots have volunteered to fly the turtles from these sites to areas around the country where they can be cared for. Now, they use these flights instead of ground transportation to reduce travel time and consequently any stress to the sick turtles, thereby increasing their chance of survival and ultimately for release back into the wild. That's according to Leslie Weinstein, and he's the guy in Idaho who has organized these GA flights. Weinstein says the effort, now branded as Turtles Fly 2, is recruiting more GA pilots who can pitch in to help during the coming cold season. He says the GA community has been amazingly generous in donating time, fuel, and planes to transport sea turtles to rehabilitation facilities for long-term medical care. He says we hope to continue to recruit new turtle flyers and welcome back our generous pilots from the last few years. Well, I went out to their website, which is turtlesfly2.org, and that 2 is TOO. And I learned that sea turtles have been around for 100 million years. There are 7 species of them, most of which are highly endangered. You can also learn on that website what cold stunning is, how that affects turtles, and they have pictures of turtles being transported, including one picture of a turtle that's looking out an airplane window. That's all at turtlesfly2.org, and I'll include a link to that in our show notes and on our Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And that's the news for this week. Coming up, an in-depth discussion on the Icon A5 aircraft and the Roy Halladay accident, plus listener questions. One pilot is working on his CFI certificate and asks how best to prepare for the oral portion of the check ride. And a student pilot in Norway has a check ride coming up, but he feels anxious when he goes out to solo, so anxious that he often cancels his flights. Stick around, we'll be right back with answers to those questions and more, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Before we get to the Icon A5 and the recent accident, let me give you a few quick updates. I flew with a gentleman a couple of times recently who owns a Cirrus. Now, I didn't teach him to get his private, but we're working on his instrument rating. He's got maybe about 150 hours, and he acknowledged at one point that he might be in that region where he's starting to get a little confident and perhaps needs to be careful that he doesn't get overconfident as he flies. And there were a couple things that he did that I followed up on. on, and I said, you really ought to take a look at this. So I thought I'd share that with you. One of them was that we were going into Monterey Airport, which has a very steep approach, the RNAV GPS Yankee 28 left. And we ended up pretty high at the minimums. And as we were approaching to land, he said something like, "I can do it," and was going to continue the approach to land. Well, I looked at it and I thought, this is ridiculous. We are absurdly high. And not only that, we've been cleared to land on 28 right, which is the short runway, which is downhill. So you combine all those things and man, it just didn't seem like a good idea to continue. So I requested a 360. We lost lots of altitude and then were able to approach on a fairly normal glide path to the airport. Now, there was something else that struck me. We had done a circle to land the week before at the Tracy Airport, and there was an aircraft that had landed right in front of us that was still on the runway, and he was planning to land, and I suggested we go around. He said, even though the other aircraft was still on the runway, "I can make it." And I thought, wow, most prudent pilots probably wouldn't land on a runway unless it was clear of all aircraft. Now, I don't think there's a specific FAR that prohibits a pilot from landing on a runway before another plane exits, but I think an inspector could, from the FAA, charge a pilot for doing that under Part 91.13 for careless or reckless operation. Now, there are times when you can do it at controlled airports, but the controller's handbook requires them to have at least 3,000 feet of separation between the aircraft. So I sent him the column which I wrote back in April for our AOPA magazine on unstable approaches. And by the way, I think I mentioned I posted that last week on our Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And I also mentioned that I had just taken a course online that same evening at FAAsafety.gov called Accident Causal Factors Series Stabilized Approaches. Now, if you want to go out to FAAsafety.gov, you can find a lot of free online courses. Just create an account for yourself, and you can also get notification of free seminars that are given at your local area. Just put in your zip code and what distance you're willing to drive, and you'll get email notifications for that. So anyway, that's course number ALC-413. And I mention all this because I wrote to him and I said, I'd like to see you transition from saying, "I can do it" when you're in a questionable situation to saying, "I might be able to do it, but the smart thing to do is go around, so I'm going around." So all of you really want to take this kind of conservative approach to everything in aviation because it has the potential to save you a lot of grief and expense and help assure that you have a long incident-free flying career, which is what we're all shooting for. And I want to talk briefly about podcasting apps and ask for everybody's help on something. I learned over the weekend that the Apple Podcast app accounts for 2/3 of all podcast listening around the world. But they made a change in iOS 11, and that has made it more difficult to binge listen to a single podcast so that you can listen for one episode after another of the same show. And you can still do it, but it's not nearly easy to do as it used to be. So some of the disgruntled listeners are now moving over to the Overcast app. Well, turns out you can really binge listen very easily in the dedicated app that our Patreon sponsors have helped me create for the Aviation News Talk podcast. And I wanted to ask people to go try it out and then please leave a review for it in the Apple App Store. So we have no reviews on it thus far, though people have told me they really like the app a lot and they find it's a convenient way to listen to Aviation News Talk podcast. So even if you decide not to switch podcast app, please go ahead and just check it out. And if you like it, leave a review. What I found nice is I can actually swipe left to right and get quickly from one episode to another. So please check that out in the App Store on Apple. Just search for Aviation News Talk. And we're still running our survey on ADS-B portable receivers. If you have one and like to let us know what your experiences have been, go out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey, give us your feedback, and we'll give those results on a future show. And I'd like to give a big thank you to the new Patreon supporters this week, who are Jim Hopp, Jen Harry Svensa, who, by the way, submitted a question we'll be answering later in the show, and Travis Carney. So you can get to the Patreon page directly from your smartphone. Just tap on the artwork at the top of the app, or go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and you can then click on post and see any of the stories we post there. People who are on the page last week immediately saw the Roy Halladay Icon A5 accident as I posted that shortly after the accident. While you're there, check out our goals and think about maybe supporting the show with a credit card donation. We have different contribution levels, and for each you get different goodies. So, for example, at the $4 a month level, Patreons get access to the original scripts for each of these shows. And at the $8 a month and above level, donors can see news stories that I've had to cut because we didn't have room for them in the show. So this week we talked about 8 news stories, but 5 others didn't make it into the show because of time considerations. And you can find those by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and signing up as one of our Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for your support. Now stick around because in 7 seconds we'll be back to talk in detail about the Icahn A5. Welcome back. Well, I'm sure that most people have heard about the crash that occurred with the Icon A5 being piloted by Roy Halladay, who was a retired Major League Baseball player here in the United States. I'll go ahead and just read a little bit from some articles for folks who are not familiar with it, and then I'll give you some details about the Icon A5. And all this will be from my perspective, and I don't talk about this a lot, but I have 2 ATP certificates in seaplane flying, so I'm ATP rated for single-engine seaplanes and also ATP rated for multi-engine seaplanes. I own a seaplane, a lake amphibian, have hundreds of hours in seaplanes, and have also been a seaplane instructor. So this first article comes from the Seattle Times, in which they say that Roy Halladay was flying his tiny light sport aircraft low over the Gulf of Mexico shortly before it slammed into the ground and killed the retired star pitcher. The NTSB investigator Noreen Price said afterwards that the Icon A5 experienced a, quote, high energy, unquote, impact with the water. She said both flight data recorders were recovered, but of course the plane did not have a voice recorder. She said that Halladay had been a licensed pilot since 2013, which would have been when he retired from Major League Baseball, that he's since logged about 700 hours of time, which is quite a bit. You figure that's close to, 180 hours a year for 4 years. She said that a preliminary report would likely take 7 to 10 days, and at this point it has not come out, but that the full investigation could take up to 2 years. She also said that it's a little early to say whether the crash was related to earlier crashes this year in the A5, one of which killed the plane's chief designer and test pilot and another employee who was being given an introductory ride in the aircraft. Now, this article says that Steve Pope, editor-in-chief of Flying Magazine, told the Associated Press that the way a lot of people describe the Icon A5 is a, quote, jet ski with wings. He said it's really a plaything. Pope continued and said the plane itself is great, but he had concerns about Halladay, a relatively inexperienced pilot, taking the craft out over water at low altitude. The plane, however, was marketed as a craft that could do just that. Here's another quote. Pope says, quote, they still think that's the way the plane should be flown, and there are people in aviation who completely disagree with that. They think you should not have a low-time pilot flying low over the water. That's a recipe for disaster, end of quote. The article also notes that low flying over the water was part of the problem when Kirk Hawkins, the designer of the aircraft, crashed back in May, also in an Icon A5. Now, flyingmagazine.com has an article up written by Steve Pope, and it says, NTSB investigators want to review video shot moments before the crash and talk with eyewitnesses who have described a pilot who may have been, quote, showboating or, quote, hot-dogging in his A5 leading up to the crash. One of those witnesses, Fred Grunden, told Flying he watched as Halladay performed a series of aggressive maneuvers at low altitude before crashing into the water under control at high speed. It looked like an air show he was putting on, Grunden said. The article also mentions that a boater who supplied video to TMZ showed Halladay's A5 banking sharply and descending low over the water and said that the airplane reached heights as low as 5 feet before the crash. And then there's this article that was published in AOPA. It was written by Richard McSpadden. He's the executive director of AOPA's Air Safety Institute, who was appointed earlier this year. Before I read it, I want you to think for a moment, general aviation pilots, where have you heard this acronym before? LOWAT, L-O-W-A-T, all capital letters. Low altitude flying, LOWAT. Is that something that you were taught during your private pilot career, or you read that anywhere else in the literature regarding flying general aviation aircraft? So let me read this. It says, from limited information and public videos, probable cause in the Halladay accident will likely stem from his not fully appreciating the dynamics of low altitude, LOWAT flying. LOWAT flying demands constant awareness of time to impact, Well, there's a phrase you don't hear often, time to impact, influenced by speed, altitude, and aircraft attitude. Minor distractions are exaggerated into significant risk because of reduced time for recognition and recovery before ground impact. Concepts like time to impact and responses like climb to cope are essential parts of the subconscious when flying low-at. Most GA aircraft, including the Icahn, have an added challenge of relatively limited engine power, which reduces the ability to escape exaggerated pitch altitudes and large sink rates. To their credit, Icahn requires transition training before aircraft delivery, which includes some low-at training. Icahn recently published a well-thought-out piece on low-at flying, providing some guidelines in consideration. So give that some thought. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few moments. But before we talk about the airplane itself, let me just mention this tweet that Roy Halladay sent out on Twitter on October 31st. It's got 4 photographs. 2 of them are of the Icon A5 beached near shore, and 2 of them are of fighter aircraft, one of which looks clearly to me to be a Northrop F5 E-fighter, which dates back to the early 1960s. So that's the jet that was used for many years by the Swiss Patrouille, which was the Swiss demo team in Switzerland. Anyway, the tweet and adjacent to these photos says, "I keep telling my dad flying the Icon A5 low over the water is like flying a fighter jet." His response, "I am flying a fighter jet." So I can only guess that his father, who we know is a corporate pilot, may be doing some work in these older fighter jets. Now let's talk about the Icon A5 itself. A lot of this comes from the Icon POH, for which I want to thank a friend of mine for sending me a copy of. He had done some flying with them earlier in the year. It is a 2-seat seaplane. It's got a foldable wing, and that allows it to be put on a trailer. The benefit of that, of course, is you could store this at home and wouldn't have to pay for tie-down expense or a hangar to store it at the airport. Not only does it have folding wings, it has removable horizontal tail tips so that it will fit on the trailer. By the way, I read that it has to be an Icahn-supplied trailer, so apparently it's got shock absorbers to make sure that the aircraft is not damaged as it's being transported over the road. Now, it's an amphibious light sport aircraft, so it's got retractable landing gear. It has a conventional high wing and a tail-aft configuration with ailerons, flaps, elevators, rudder, and water rudder control surfaces. The tricycle landing gear is retractable. It's equipped with a Rotax 912 IS Sport 4-cylinder 100-horsepower engine. It's built out of carbon fiber, and it says that the carbon structure is strong, but it could be damaged if loaded in an unintended manner. And the POH says the A5 is designed to support a person of up to 250 pounds of total weight. Apparently that's a limitation because of the carbon fiber. It's got a wingspan of 34.5 feet, so we'll come back to that later. Just remember that's about a 34-foot wingspan. The primary flight controls are described as conventional sticks and rudders with toe brakes for each seat, and electrically operated pitch trim control, which is operated from the pilot's left seat on the stick. It's equipped for day and night VFR only. It is prohibited for use in IMC, can't legally be used for IFR flying. Maximum gross weight, 1,510 pounds. Now, I think they had to get a gross weight increase from the FAA to do that because it's certified as an SLSA, and normally I believe the max weight on that is 1,320 pounds. Normal cruise speed is described as 84 knots. Now, that's at 8,000 feet, and that's also about the same speed at the surface. By the way, most seaplanes are pretty slow with a few exceptions. The home-built Seawind is probably one of the exceptions. It's a pretty fast seaplane. Now, VY, your best rate of climb, pretty slow, 58 knots. And the climb rate at VY, 629 feet per minute. The stall speed in a clean configuration, that is with flaps and landing gear up, is 45 knots. In the dirty configuration, landing gear and flaps down, stall speed is 39 knots. Now, those stall speeds are for level flight. If you have a steep turn going on, well, stall speeds go up dramatically. Here's what it is if you increase the bank to 60 degrees, which, by the way, it'd be consistent with videos we've seen of Roy Halladay over the Gulf of Mexico. At 60-degree bank, the stall speed with flaps set at 0 jumps from 45 knots in level flight to 64 knots in a steep turn. And with full flaps at 30 degrees, it jumps from 39 knots to 55 knots at a 60-degree bank. The aircraft holds 20 gallons of usable fuel. It has a maximum demonstrated crosswind of 12 knots, which, by the way, landing seaplanes in a crosswind on the water definitely has its challenges. You can have the waves moving in one direction, the water moving in another direction, and the wind coming from yet a third direction. So it's always pretty tough to figure out which way to land it. Typically, you want to land it across the waves and then tolerate whatever crosswind that you happen to have. Now, the maximum design load for this aircraft is plus 4 Gs and minus 2 Gs. That's very, very close to the design limitations for a Part 23 aircraft like a Cessna 172 in the normal category. For aerobatic flight, typically you need an aircraft which is designed for the aerobatic category, which is going to be plus 6 Gs. If you're operating on the water, they say the maximum suggested wave height, 12 inches. Saltwater operations are approved. They say to rinse with fresh water afterwards. They then go on to say that aerobatic maneuvers are prohibited. In fact, it says all aerobatic maneuvers are prohibited. The aircraft is not certified for aerobatics, inverted flight, or sustained zero-G or negative G flight. Intentional or attempted spins are prohibited. Prolonged periods in stalled flight are to be avoided. And they say on the water, warning, contacting the wingtip with the water while in motion can create a dangerous situation and must be avoided. And I would say that probably understates the problem. For most seaplanes, if you catch a wingtip, in the worst case, you're going to do what's called a water loop. If it's not too high speed, you'll come out of that okay. If it's really high speed, you could end up in a cartwheel situation, and those are often fatal. Let's take a look at the airframe. Icahn has done a lot of great things to make this airframe spin resistant. In fact, they've done some of the same things that the Klapmeyer brothers did when they designed the Cirrus, which was introduced back in 1999. So, for example, they have wing stall strips, 2 per side, same as the Cirrus. They have wing vortex generators. Now, I have those on my seaplane. All of that's, by the way, to help maintain laminar flow at slow airspeeds, which gives you better controllability. It also has fuselage vortex generators and flap fences. All of these things, by the way, are designed to keep a stall from progressing rapidly to the outboard section of the wing where the ailerons are. So as a stall starts to begin near the wing root close to the fuselage, you'll start to get buffeting, but you'll still have good smooth air going over the ailerons, which means that to some extent you can actually use ailerons to help control yourself in a stall, whereas in most aircraft you would have to use rudders in a stall because the ailerons are no longer effective. So they've done a good job designing the wing on the Icon A5. And also, like the Cirrus, the Icon A5 has a parachute system. POH says that it should be used ideally above 500 feet AGL, which is about the same level that Cirrus recommends as well. They say it's useful for loss of control, for engine failures below 1,000 AGL with no suitable landing area. Now, that seems a little odd to me. I would think that you could also use it if you were above 1,000 feet and had an engine failure. Cirrus training, I would say, goes a little bit further than this and suggests that unless there's an airport directly under you at any altitude, that you should go ahead and use the parachute. And we'll talk more in some future show why that's the case. Approximately 48 pounds of pressure required to actuate the system. Descent rate will be about 1,200 feet per minute. And this is kind of interesting. The landing gear will automatically extend following the parachute deployment. Once extended, landing gear cannot be raised. Instructions for using it, very simple. Step 1, pull the cap handle hard. Also very similar to the Cirrus. Let's talk about water landings. They say that for water landings, the gear must be up. No surprise there. Flaps are to be at 30 degrees, and you should be at less than 75 knots. Water rudder must be up. And then they don't specify a landing airspeed, which is really unusual. Instead, they specify an angle of attack, which is that you should match the AOA to the white line. And so I think what that really means is that you could use a combination of airspeeds and power settings as long as you had the proper angle of attack coming in, and that makes sense to me. Now, the instrument panel layout is particularly interesting. I have read elsewhere that they wanted to have a simplified layout, and indeed it's pretty clean. It almost has kind of a automobile feel to it. Most prominent instrument located at the very top is the AOA indicator. Right below that is going to be the airspeed, the altitude, and also the attitude indicator. Interestingly, that's it for flight instruments. So there is no vertical speed indicator, which really surprises me, and we'll talk about that later. That's really kind of important when you're doing steep turns. And also there are no other gyros such as turn coordinator or heading indicator. and then all the engine gauges are along the bottom. Now, talking about the AOA, they said it provides a visual indication of how hard the wing is working to generate lift and how much lift it can supply at any given time. They say AOA is related to stick position, so the AOA gauge can also provide an approximate indication of the current stick position and how much farther aft it can move before the wing will stall. They say it works by using static ports to measure the difference in pressure from the top and bottom of the left wing near the leading edge. They say these values are compared and computed to drive the AOA indicator electrically. The horizontal line on the gauge depicts optimal AOA during approach for landing. That's the white line that we just talked about. And also the maximum lift to drag ratio, which can be used for best range performance and best glide. They say the AOA can also be used to help guide control inputs to achieve specific performance objectives during every phase of flight. The ability to reference AOA during each of these phases allows much more precise inputs and also provides direct information about how the wing is performing at any given time. During a turn, the AOA provides a direct indication of margin above stall in all phases of flight. This permits optimization of turn performance safely and efficiently. For cruise, AOA allows for efficient flight by providing a simple cue for optimum range performance. They say the gauge is disabled at speeds below 30 knots. Now, an engineering friend of mine wrote to me this week and said that it's not actually an AOA that they use in the A5. He said instead that it's an LRI, which I had to ask him what that was. He said it's a lift reserve indicator. He says it's sort of an AOA indicator, but it's really just a pressure gauge attached to two ports hanging off the wing. Its signal is correlated with angle of attack given various inputs, but it's not quite the same. He gave me a website, liftreserve.com. On that website, it says LRI has been called an angle of attack instrument. It may be. It's kind of interesting comment from the manufacturer. The discussion is still open on this. The LRI does identify the absolute stall angle for any aircraft. What makes the lift reserve indicator unique is that the LRI integrates angle of attack and airspeed in a single, immediately clear analog readout. They say angle of attack and airspeed are the two fundamental components of lift, and the LRI provides continuous and steady visual display of the condition of an aircraft's lift throughout its slow speed envelope, regardless of the many variables that act upon the aircraft. And this instrument sells for about $450, which I think is significantly lower than the cost of most AOA angle of attack indicators that you can purchase. So overall, I think it's a relatively safe airplane, though I will say that I don't think the parachute will be used nearly as much as it is in the Cirrus. The problem is most seaplane flying is done at lower altitudes, below 2,000 feet. That's because as seaplane pilots, we don't want to get hit from behind by faster aircraft. So I think there will be accidents in the future where the aircraft is going to be too low to use the parachute, unfortunately. Cirrus aircraft are flying high all the time, and so the parachute will get used a lot more percentage-wise. Probably the one thing I would have done differently in designing this aircraft, I would have included a vertical speed indicator. That's an absolutely critical instrument when doing things like steep turns to figure out what your future performance is like. Now, granted, that instrument does lag 5 to 6 seconds, but it's still enough of an indication to let you know if you're going to be getting into trouble. And I should say that when I'm watching people doing standard steep turns at 45-degree banks, it's amazing how quickly you can lose 100 feet. I mean, I would imagine that easily less than 8-10 seconds, people will lose 100 feet at a 45-degree bank turn. And at 60-degree bank, they're going to lose it much faster. So I hope the company adds a vertical speed indicator. I think that will be helpful. Other than that, I think it's a sound aircraft. I will be really surprised if, like the first accident where we found that there was the plane was not responsible, I think, again, that with a Roy Halladay accident, they're probably going to exonerate the aircraft as well. I don't think it's the aircraft design which is the root of the problem here. But let's talk about some things that might be contributing to the problem. In October, just a few weeks before the accident, Icahn released what they called their low-altitude flying guidelines. And this article in AvWeb talks about it. It said, citing a lack of FAA guidance or industry expertise in training pilots for low-altitude operation, kind of an interesting statement right there. It says, hey, the industry isn't training people to fly low. Well, I wonder why. Icahn Aircraft has created guidelines for pilots flying the A5 and is preparing a low-altitude training course for pilots who want to go lower than the guidelines provide. Our goal is to take a proactive leadership role in the flight training process, and we have developed our own own low-altitude guidelines from lessons learned over decades of military, seaplane, and bush flying. The policy creates a 300-foot soft deck. Now, by the way, how many people have heard of a soft deck before today? I would submit that that's a phrase that's almost never used in general aviation. Try searching it on the web. You're going to find that it's rarely used at all, except perhaps in naval aviation. The policy creates a 300-foot soft deck below which the flight envelope is restricted to 45 degrees in bank and 10 degrees in pitch. Icahn is preparing an advanced low-altitude training course and check ride to bring the qualified pilot's soft deck down to 100 feet above the ground. The length and curriculum are still under development. Now, this policy, which is posted on their website, and I'll post a link to this, says that, among other things, Icahn considers below 300 feet as operating in the low-altitude environment for the Icon A5. They say at 300 feet AGL, while level at normal flying speeds, the A5 should be able to execute an engine-out 100-degree turn to a landing under normal conditions under proper pilot inputs. By the way, I think most seaplanes will be able to do that. So sure, if you lost your engine and had to turn 180 degrees to reach a landing spot, that's a pretty reasonable thing to do. Now let's come back to the term soft deck, because the next section of this is called soft deck maneuvering. When I searched, I found a few places that defined it. One said, and this was from hayesgray.org, it said soft deck, parentheses, aviation, a safety altitude below which certain maneuvers are prohibited during ACM, expressed as feet AGL, typically 5,000 feet AGL. Well, I had to look up ACM. ACM is air combat maneuvering or dogfighting practice, according to the same website, which has a list of what they call naval terms. So this section here now called soft deck maneuvering. We know that term obviously comes from the military. The use of a soft deck is central to Icahn's low-alt flying philosophy. Now, low-alt, that's a contraction they've come up of low altitude, LOWALT. Now, interestingly, that's not the same acronym that Richard McSpadden used in his AOPA article. He was talking about low-at, so the L is missing. So I did a quick search to find out what low-at means, and on the globalsecurity.org page under military definitions, they say that low-altitude air-to-air training, or LOAT, is one element of training. LOAT, concerned with aircraft intercept strategies, consist of maneuvers commonly executed in conjunction with other training missions. 2 to 4 aircraft are usually involved in this training, conducted in approved airspace. These LOAT maneuvers are generally executed between 500 and 5,000 feet above ground level. In a typical scenario, 2 aircraft simulate a low-altitude approach to attack a specific target. Okay, getting back to the low-altitude flying guidelines on the Icahn website, in the section labeled soft deck maneuvering, they say the use of a soft deck is central to Icahn's low-alt flying philosophy. The idea is that when in the low-altitude environment, the PIC should shift a significant portion of their attention to terrain and obstacle avoidance, like towers, power lines, etc., while also maneuvering more benignly. This conscious shift should be observed below a prescribed altitude or soft deck. While good judgment and airmanship always take precedence over any guidelines, the following maneuvering limits should generally be observed. Above the soft deck, which they've said is 300 feet, normal non-aerobatic maneuvering, plus and minus 60 degrees of bank, plus and minus 30 degrees of pitch. Below the soft deck of 300 feet, benign maneuvering, plus and minus 45 degrees of bank and plus and minus 10 degrees of pitch. And they go on to say that the 60 degrees of bank, 30 degrees of pitch as a reference. The current FAR aerobatic definition is ambiguous. In the past, the definition included these 60-30 limits, but FAR 91.303 currently states aerobatic flight means an intentional maneuver involving an abrupt change in an aircraft's attitude, an abnormal attitude, or abnormal acceleration, not necessary for normal flight. And it also mentions 91.307 that states unless each occupant of the aircraft is wearing an approved parachute, no pilot of a civil aircraft carrying any person other than a crew member may execute any intentional maneuvers that exceed 60 degrees relative to the horizon, or a nose-up pitch attitude up or down of 30 degrees relative to the horizon. And they give the Icahn soft deck training qualifications. The standard qualifications to have a soft deck at 300 feet AGL, appropriate for all Icahn graduates, and they mention Icahn SPL, TXL, Icon IP or higher, so I'm not sure what that is. But then they say they're going to have their advanced soft deck, so you can now do all of these maneuvers down to 100 AGL if you have the advanced Icahn low-alt training and Icahn check ride, which according to the AvWeb article is still under development. Now let's talk about some of the videos, both of the Roy Halladay accident last week as well as those that are on the Icahn website to help market that aircraft. In the TMZ video, they took a frame grab as the aircraft was banking, and it showed, when I measured it in Photoshop, to be around 62 degrees of bank. Well, I posted this, by the way, on Facebook, and some folks said, yeah, but you can't exactly measure the bank unless the aircraft is coming straight at you. It's not coming exactly straight at you, but it's pretty close. So I think we can assume the aircraft was reasonably close to 60 degrees of bank. If you measure the wing length of the aircraft, you can see that it's about 3 wing lengths above the water. Now, you may recall that the wingspan on the A5 is 34 feet. So that means that that aircraft at that point was almost exactly 100 feet above the water. I think Icahn may at some point come back and, in their defense, say that Roy Halladay was exceeding the soft deck limits, that he was exceeding 45 degrees bank when he was below 300 feet AGL. I assume that AvWeb is correct and that the advanced check ride, which would permit the soft deck to be lowered to 100 feet AGL, has not been released yet. Witnesses, of course, said that they had seen the aircraft horsing around for multiple days before the accident, and so apparently Roy was out there having a fair amount of fun, banking and zooming up and down with the aircraft. If you go onto the Icahn website, their experience video is kind of illustrative of, I think, what they're trying to sell as the experience in this aircraft. At 1 minute and 21 seconds into the video, they show it passing very low over a rock cliff. A few seconds later, it drops very rapidly to join up in formation with another aircraft that looks to be less than 100 feet above Lake Berryessa here in Northern California, because you can clearly see tree branches sticking out from the water below. So I think the aircraft will be pretty low for you to be able to identify individual tree branches. And then it shows the two aircraft turning in formation at a 45-degree bank, again low over the water, at about 1 minute and 32 seconds into the video. Now, they also have a video called A5 Angle of Attack, AOA, and they demonstrate how the AOA is used for landing, that you're to approach in the white band, flare near the water, cut the power, and then pitch up until the AOA is in the yellow band, which to me makes a lot of sense. Sounds like a pretty way to consistently land a seaplane accurately. Now, they demonstrate a steep turn at 4 minutes and 50 seconds. It's also at low altitude over the lake. And they say in the narration, relying primarily on the AOA gauge, the pilot is able to consistently max perform the A5 while safely avoiding entering an accelerated stall. I want you to remember those words, max perform the A5. We're going to come back to that again. Now, in that video, there's a split screen. On the left half, it shows a pilot's view looking out the window as they make a steep turn. And it's easy to see at the top of the frame the angle that's formed between the glare shield and the seashore. I went into Photoshop and measured and found that aircraft to be in a 75-degree bank. Now, on the right side, they show an aircraft also in a bank. It's a head-on shot, so you can pretty accurately measure it. It's banked less, perhaps around 60 degrees. And the AOA indicator is shown during this turn, doing a rapid transition from being at the bottom of the green, so lots of lift available. Suddenly, it's up to 3/4 of the way into the yellow, just short of the red line, which I guess would be max performing the aircraft. Sadly, in that same video, it has the chief designer, John Karkow, who died in the May crash at about 5:24 into the video. And he says, quote, "The most fun you can have, I think, in any sport, and flying is a sport, is when the tool you're using is out of mind, you're just flying. The tool is translucent, it's seamless, you're not even thinking about it, you're just doing the flying. Our mission is to make the plane just so easy to fly, so instinctive, so intuitive, that you're just free to have the most fun possible." Couple points. I've never thought of flying as a sport, though I'm sure some people do. And I think I agree that it is nice to be able to just use the tool out of mind, just fly, and not even be thinking about it. But I think that's highly inconsistent with low-altitude maneuvering, pulling 60-degree banks at 300 feet or 100 feet above the water. Certainly, you can do both, but not at the same time. So there's kind of a mixed marketing message. Now, sadly, Icahn had released a video of Roy Halladay and his wife, Brandy, just a few weeks before. And in it, Halladay said, quote, "She fought me the whole way." And then his wife said, and these are all quotes from the video, "Hard, I fought hard. I was very against it. I went down with him one day to the training center in St. Pete, and they said, 'Oh, you want to go up for a ride?' And I got up in the plane. I looked over and I said, 'Okay, I get it. I get it. This is amazing.' You forget that you're in a plane. You're just there. You're experiencing the beauty of Florida or the water or the lake, wherever you are." Now, there's also an interesting article that appeared in Wired magazine in 2015 in which the author flew with Kirk Hawkins. Hawkins says, flying had this complex, regulated transportation mentality, but the best flying I've ever done was always at low altitudes with the window open. I wanted to make a great flying airplane that creates an emotional response but isn't intimidating, that makes you want to fly it like driving a great sports car. Flying like this is easy. Anyone can do it, he says, giving me the stick and telling me to bring the aircraft in a level buzz above the water. Hawkins said, stick and rudder basics are easy. I could teach you to solo in 5 hours. And by the way, if any of our listeners have soloed in 5 hours, please let me know, because that's pretty unusual. After I posted the story of the accident last week on Twitter, a number of people responded back to me. I'll read you a few of the tweets. This comes from Rigger Runner. He said, but look, Icon A5 advertising photos that show planes turning within inches from the water, encouraging bad behavior, ? And here's a reply from Matt Gutmiller, who says, I don't think they have a fighting chance at this point, but more than training, they need to fix their marketing that says this is what the planes are designed for and make trivial. And Wired for Flight says, my worry is that Icahn will get a reputation like Cirrus started to get, a doctor killer. Cirrus fought back with a high-level training program. I think Icahn has to do as well. And Eric Holtzman says, very sad. It's one thing to do maneuvers in an aerobatic box with a proper plane. It's a whole nother thing to do it in an LSA over water. And to that I would add at low altitude. Victory 205 says you can only tie the low altitude record. No reason to play the game. Fighter jet is a dorky media term, and the use of the word reveals an immature mindset. Aviation requires discipline and respect. It isn't a game. And from New Mexico Sport Aviation, ever watch an Icahn promo video? It's all low-level maneuvering. How could that go wrong? Well, I think we know how it can go wrong, and we talked about low-altitude maneuvering going wrong just last week, only 24 hours before the Roy Halladay accident. Some pilots just like flying low. They may get an adrenaline rush, it feels good, and some people just need that feeling, but I'm guessing if they knew that behavior could end up killing them, they wouldn't do it. Now, some people on Facebook argued that what Roy Halladay was reported to be doing was not illegal because it was not aerobatic flight. And by the way, the Icon A5 POH prohibits aerobatic flight. So if Roy was indeed doing aerobatic flight, and I'm not saying he was exceeding the limitations of the Icon A5 that are spelled out in the POH, which would be illegal. Now, here's the key issue. Witnesses say the A5 was banking sharply and descending low over the water. So the question I'll ask you is that behavior necessary for normal flight? Because if it wasn't necessary for normal flight, he was performing aerobatics. FAR 91.303 currently states aerobatic flight means an intentional maneuver involving an abrupt change in an aircraft's attitude, an abnormal attitude, or abnormal acceleration not necessary for normal flight. So the first question is, was it aerobatics? I don't know, but it sure sounds like it could have been. But a second question is, has Icahn done anything that might encourage pilots to believe that this kind of low-altitude maneuvering is okay or even normal for GA pilots to perform? Now, let me first say, I think that Kirk Hawkins and Icahn Aircraft have designed a wonderful airplane, and they've done it against impossible odds. I mean, of the hundreds of companies that seek to design and sell an airplane, only a handful ever succeed in getting their aircraft certified and into production. So it's really a tribute to what I perceive to be Icahn's aggressive, hard-charging approach to knocking down barriers and getting the job done. And here in Silicon Valley, that approach is admired as it's built many successful companies. And that fast pace is part of what attracted me to Silicon Valley and why I moved here when I worked in high tech. So kudos to Kirk and his team for what they've accomplished. However, I don't think that a hard-charging fighter jock culture is the correct approach to flight training. And when I say that, please understand that the goals of an airplane manufacturer and the goals of a senior flight instructor such as myself are not the same. So I wouldn't expect senior executives at Icahn to agree with what I'm about to say because we have different goals and we see the world through different lenses. Now, the goal of any aviation manufacturer is simple. It's to sell airplanes, and all manufacturers do it by segmenting the market, figuring out who the most likely buyers of their aircraft could be, what these people want, and how best to appeal to them so that they will part with their hard-earned dollars to buy an airplane. Now, the CEO, Kirk Hawkins, a former fighter pilot, he's hired other ex-fighter pilots as flight instructors. Now, the goal of a fighter pilot is totally different than that of a general aviation flight instructor and a GA pilot. The goal of a fighter pilot, as I understand it, is to get the absolute maximum performance out of an aircraft, to push it to the absolute limits so that you can kill the enemy. Now, remember the video we talked about that ironically was called Safety A5 Angle of Attack? In it, the narrator said, quote, relying primarily on the AOA gauge, the pilot is able to consistently max perform the A5 while safely avoiding entering an accelerated stall. Let me state unequivocally, the goal of a general aviation flight instructor is not to max perform an aircraft, to bank it as steeply as possible while going up to the edge of a stall. Instead, our goal is to teach pilots to understand the limits of their aircraft and the limits of their abilities, and to help them learn to build lots of extra margin into everything they do. So if the minimum altitude to perform stalls on a check ride is 1,500 feet AGL, which it is, let's do them at 3,000 feet. And if the bottom of the class Bravo is 2,500 feet, let's stay at 2,000 feet. And if you're going to practice steep turns with 60-degree banks, let's not do them 100 feet above the water. Let's do them thousands of feet in the air. And why not do them at 45 degrees or 50 degrees instead of going right up to the exact edge of what's legal to do in an airplane certified in the normal category? So here's what's concerning me. I'm concerned that Icahn may be normalizing low-altitude maneuvering as something that should be normal in general aviation, and that any GA pilot with a proper training can safely perform. I'm concerned that by writing standards that suggest that with a proper training, any pilot can do this safely, normalizes it. Kind of makes it sound acceptable and safe. After all, just stay above 300 feet or above 100 feet and everything will be okay as you do 60-degree bank turns. And what about the use of terms like low alt and no watt and soft deck, which I have never heard in general aviation in the 45 years I've been flying? Does that make low altitude maneuvering sound cool and sexy? Does it somehow legitimize it because, hey, no watt's a thing in the military, so it must be okay? I mean, does talking about a soft deck evoke memories of Tom Cruise and Top Gun going below the hard deck? Does that appeal to some latent desire in the average pilot that they too could fly like a fighter pilot? Now, I get that both Kirk Hawkins and Richard McSpadden of AOPA are retired military pilots, and they may be used to throwing around terms like low alt and no watt. But did they get that the average GA pilot does not have the skills and capabilities of the average military pilot? Now, I'm guessing the average military pilot is under age 30, but the average GA pilot is over 50. And the average military pilot gets rigorous training, and for years, their entire life revolves around aviation. By contrast, the average GA pilot has a non-flying job that takes at least 40 hours a week. They may have family responsibilities, and they may be lucky to fly 40 hours a year. Now, if they own an aircraft, they probably fly more, maybe 100 hours a year. But does anyone think a part-time pilot with a full-time job can safely do 60-degree bank turns a few hundred feet above the water? Why, I don't. And I certainly wouldn't teach it or encourage it. And I've flown with many seaplane instructors and many seaplane pilots, and not a single one of them ever demonstrated or encouraged aggressive maneuvering, and certainly not close to the water. And by the way, one of those instructors was a retired military pilot, but he didn't treat his seaplanes like the jets that he used to fly. He treated them with the care and the caution they deserve, because landing on the water is much less forgiving than landing on a solid runway. Land pilots, you guys don't have to contend with a landing strip that has ripples in it and is constantly moving. Now, by the way, there's a danger in marketing aircraft in any way that suggests they can be used aggressively. Richard Collins wrote this a few years ago about the Columbia 350 and 400 planes, which, by the way, I've been factory trained in. He said, for one thing, the 350-400 might not have as thorough a training program as the Cirrus has. Even more important, though, is the pilot personality factor. The 350-400 comes across as a more aggressive airplane than the Cirrus, and more aggressive airplanes have always attracted more aggressive pilots. Certainly the accidents that the 350-400 had as Lancer and Columbia airplanes reflected this. By the way, in my opinion, Richard was wrong on one point. When I took the Columbia factory training in 2006, it was every bit as good as the factory training I took at Cirrus. But I will say it's not unusual for a new aircraft company to have problems in their training programs that need to be corrected. That was certainly the case in the early days at Cirrus, and it may be the case now in the early days of Icahn. Now, in the case of Cirrus, they had young factory instructors, many of whom were fresh out of college, and the instructor I was assigned was knowledgeable and helpful in almost all ways, but he liked to land the Cirrus fast, and he didn't realize the dangers in doing so. Now, I'm guessing this factory training job was a convenient way for him to build the hours he needed to move on to an airline job or somewhere else where he could fly jets. And he told me he really liked to land the SR-22 at 100 knots and proceeded to demonstrate that. Well, what this young pilot never considered was how much worse the outcome would be at 100 knots if we encountered a blown tire, a gust of wind, or some other issue leading to an accident. 100 knots is 30% faster than the 77-knot short-field landing speed of the SR20 we were flying. So in the event of an accident, we would have been carrying 69% more energy than if we were at the recommended landing speed. And all that extra energy, man, that just makes the injuries worse. And looking back, it's clear that in this time frame, many Cirrus pilots were landing too fast, and some still do even to this day. Now, undoubtedly, these higher speeds have resulted in deaths that could have been just injuries if only the pilots were flying at the proper speed. Getting back to Richard Collins' comment about aggressive pilots, he has a point. There are some aggressive, thrill-seeking pilots out there, but they're not created by airplane manufacturers. But manufacturers who choose to attract these pilots need to understand that they're likely to have a higher accident rate as a result. But improvements to training programs could help. And again, Cirrus is a great example. In the early days, they had an accident rate that was much higher than other manufacturers. But in the last 3 to 4 years, through a revised training program that places more emphasis on using the CAPS parachute, they've substantially lowered their fatal accident rate, and now it's just half the rate of all other aircraft in general aviation used for personal and business flying. I think the same parallel can be drawn between Cirrus and Icahn. Both are well-designed modern airplanes that are safe, but pilots are not perfect, and they're responsible for the majority of the accidents in these otherwise sound aircraft. Better training has substantially fixed that problem at one of these manufacturers. And as for aggressive thrill-seeking pilots who really just look for where that next adrenaline rush is going to come from, I'd like to recommend a podcast for you. Check out episode 142 of the Happiness Podcast by Dr. Robert Puff. He suggests that thrill seekers, especially those with lots of money who buy one toy after another or one experience after another, are never going to be truly happy. They're always going to be looking externally for that next thrill to stay happy, and he explains why if you're looking externally for happiness, you're not going to find it. As for Icahn, I really do wish them the best of success, and I think they will be successful. But I also hope they'll take a hard look at their marketing strategy and their factory training program to see if there is anything at all they can improve that might help reduce the possibility of another tragic accident like the one last week. Because in the wake of any accident, we all have to take a hard look, no matter how painful it may be, to see if there's anything that can be improved so that maybe we can spare future families the agony that comes from an accident. To leave any stone unturned in that process would be unconscionable. We'll be right back. And if I can say just one more thing, God, I hate aircraft accidents. Been to too many funerals, too many good pilots who've passed away. So certainly I'm doing everything I can to help keep you folks safe. Hey, let's talk about some happier things. I want to talk about the Apple Podcast app reviews we've gotten this past week. Thanks to desertpilot.com and to DeBito, who says, Trescott is currently providing the most relevant, useful information about GA. Thanks for that. And TDog77SC says, this is the best aviation podcast I've found. Nothing but excellent information. And by the way, I looked through all the reviews, and you know what? We have never had a review from New Zealand. I know we have lots of listeners down there. So anybody in New Zealand, give us a review if you would in the Apple Podcast app. And as I mentioned earlier, check out our dedicated app that's now available in the Apple App Store. Just search on Aviation News Talk. Let's go to some listener feedback. We have some of the greatest listeners. I love hearing from you every week. Let's see. Listener Craig says, I was thinking how your podcast has the most relevant information. Too true today. And of course, he has a link to the Roy Halladay accident, which is kind of an odd coincidence. We were just talking about low-level maneuvering last week. From Brian, he says, somehow it was only today that I heard the last part of episode 36 and thus Roger Whittier's authoritative answer to my question. It's exactly the kind of relevant, trusted information that makes your podcast so important to the GA community and especially to Cirrus pilots. Much as I enjoy and learn from, and he mentioned several other podcasts, it's yours that teaches me things I can use the next day in the plane. Well, thanks for that. I appreciate that, Brian. And let's see here. Ken up in Minnesota says, just finished listening to the episode about general aviation risk management and could not help but call you out on something you said toward the end of the show about refueling aircraft. You said during normal rains, you're probably going to be okay. just couldn't help but point that out. Haha. Thanks for the great show. Funny guy, Ken. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I had been talking about anytime you use the word probably or think the word probably, you might want to come up with a plan with a more certain outcome. So thanks, Ken. All right, from LinkedIn, Mark in Rockford, Illinois says, I'm a private pilot working on my instrument rating, just started listening to aviation news. It has been helpful. And he also passed along a topic idea for a future show. So thanks, Mark, for that. And now let's go to some listener questions.
Hello, Max. Love your show. Great podcast. My name is Jan. I'm a student pilot from Norway, very close to finishing my PPL. I only have a few hours of cross-country solo left, and then it's the check ride, and I should be good to go. Problem is, I feel a kind of anxiety every time I go out now. It has developed lately after soloing, actually. It has become a bigger and bigger problem. And now the problem is so big that I usually cancel flights before I go out and fly them, because I have a fear of messing up. I have a fear of flying to new airports with new traffic patterns and new kind of things that I meet. I know I'm not alone in having this problem, but my question is simply, are there any fixes, and how do we go about in order to remedy this and to face our fear, so to speak? Keep up the good job on the podcast. Looking forward to it every week, and thank you.
Jan, thanks so much for your question. I think you're doing absolutely the right thing. I think a lot of people who have fears and anxiety don't talk about them, and they get bigger and more fearful. So thanks for asking the question, being willing to open up and share your fears. Let me do the same thing and tell you that I have had anxiety at times when I'm flying, and not just as a student pilot. If I look back, probably about 5 years ago, maybe a little bit longer ago than that, there was a period of probably a year or two where I felt pretty anxious every time I went flying alone. And I think part of it was I had just gotten so used to flying with other pilots as a flight instructor that I almost never flew alone anymore. And I just got really, really anxious. In fact, I can kind of remember it right now. I feel myself getting anxious as I talk about it. A couple things changed. One, I would play my music. I would go ahead and plug in my earbuds, even underneath my headset. And I found that the music was very calming and relaxing for me as I was flying. And I think just over time, I realized that the fear I had was irrational, and it eventually went away. But I think you're facing something that might be slightly rational, so let's talk about that. First of all, I think anxiety is normal even as a licensed pilot. But particularly as a student pilot, if you had zero anxiety, I'd be really worried that you didn't understand that there are a few real dangers out there that pilots need to pay attention to when they're flying, some of which we've already just talked about earlier in the show. So anxiety, it serves a number of purposes, but when we're a bit worried, that makes us on alert, we stay safe, and that fear kind of helps protect us from the harm. But sometimes our brain goes awry and we get carried away and we become too hypervigilant, too fearful. Our fears get overblown and irrational, and then the anxiety isn't helpful, and it gets in the way of the things that we want to do. And I think that's what was happening to me. Now, in your case, it sounds like you're a little concerned when you're flying out to other airports. You mentioned that you're concerned about new traffic patterns. And to me, it sounds like the fear of the unknown. So it sounds like when you're at your home airport, you're more familiar with it, so you're less concerned. But when you go elsewhere, you're feeling nervous. So I would suggest before you go to another airport, just research the heck out of that new airport. Find out everything you can find about it. Figure out the best way to approach the airport, what runway you're likely to be assigned, and then try to guess what type of entry you're likely to be assigned, whether they're going to have you enter on the 45 or on the downwind or on the base, or if they're going to give you a straight-in approach to land. And you also might want to document that. Go ahead and find the most likely approaches you think you're going to have. That way you'll have them with you in the airplane when you finally know what runway you're going to be assigned and what approach they're going to be giving you, whether it's the downwind or base or whatever. You can just quickly refer to your notes. The other thing is you might want to go to Google Earth. Go ahead and take a look at the maps. Try to see what things look like around that airport. It's going to help you a lot when you get oriented and arrive at a strange airport to kind of know what it looks like ahead of time. Now, I would also check out the taxiway diagrams, especially especially for larger airports. So you know ahead of time how you're likely to be instructed to taxi back to the runway. And I would not park there. That just makes things more complex and it increases your workload. So just taxi back to the runway after you land, then take all the time you need to prepare for your return trip and take off. Now, you might want to also listen to ATC over the internet ahead of time if it's available, so that you can hear the controllers ahead of time and figure out how most pilots are instructed when they arrive at the airport. You can also role-play the trip ahead of time with an instructor or another pilot, and you could even script it out if you'd like. And here's one of the biggest mistakes I see with pilots going to unfamiliar airports. As you get close to the airport, if you are not fully prepared to approach and land, turn away from the airport, finish all of your preparation, and only then turn back around and return to the airport to land. Too many people rush it. They get there, they're unprepared, and then things don't go well. So if you're not ready, turn away from the airport and then come back when you are ready. You might also want to consider recording your flights. You don't even need video to do that. You could just do it on audio. I do it with the Lightspeed headset that I have, the Zulu 3, and the FlightLink app on my iPhone. Otherwise, you may have to create a patch cord that connects the intercom system to your recorder. After your return, debrief the flight. Write down everything that went well, write down everything that didn't go well, and see what you learned from the flight. That way, next time you go flying, you can go ahead and review your notes and you'll have an even better flight. So, Jan, thanks so much for contacting us, and drop me a line and let me know how things go. And here's a question that came in this morning from Jimmy. He's one of our Patreon sponsors. Thanks so much for that. He runs the Plain Faith podcast, and he's in Huntsville, Alabama. He says, I'm focusing in now on preparing for the oral portion of the practical exam, and he's talking about the CFI exam. And he says, honestly, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. There is just so much material. On top of that, there are so many good books and resources out there that I feel like I'm struggling to identify a smaller subset of those to focus in on while studying, and he mentions a number of them. Anyway, I was wondering if you could spare a few minutes to give me some tips on how best to prepare for the initial CFI, particularly the oral exam. P.S. I enjoy your podcast tremendously. It's become my favorite and most anticipated. Well, thanks for the question, Jimmy. Yes, I can understand you being overwhelmed. I remember that feeling when I was studying for the CFI as well. And you are absolutely right. Focus on the oral. That is the crux of the entire check ride, I think. The flying part, pretty easy compared to the standing up at the blackboard and teaching a lesson part. So here's what I would say. For the oral, I would expect to be asked to teach at least a couple of maneuvers. So the examiner most likely will say something like, all right, teach me now how to do steep turns, or now teach me how to do lazy eights. So besides doing the lesson plans, you're going to get quizzed on the training requirements. So you're going to need to know all of the requirements to become a commercial pilot, a private pilot, how many hours are required, how many miles long those cross-country exams are, how many hours a night flying, is it solo, is it dual, and so on. You're also going to be required to know all of the endorsements that are going to be required for the private and the commercial check rides, and that could get pretty complex. And finally, you're going to certainly be quizzed on the fundamentals of instruction topics, plus anything else that's listed in the PTS. And finally, you're going to be prepared to be incredibly knowledgeable about the FARs. They could be asking you just about anything along those lines. Now, Jimmy had asked whether he should focus in on just the FAA books, and he listed the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, the Airplane Flying Handbook, the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, the CFI PTS, the Private and Commercial ACS, along with the FAR AIM and ASA's Oral Exam Guide. And I said, yes, absolutely, those are the ones to focus in on. He mentioned a few others, and I said, steer clear of that, but stick mostly with the FAA books if you have to focus on some of them. And finally, I told him I would recommend that you do what I did, which is, and this was brutal, read the entire AIM, the Aeronautical Information Manual. Now, it took me a couple of weeks, but talk about a great way to get familiar with things that you should know. While doing it, you might want to take notes on topics that strike you as important that you think you might not remember. That way, you'll have a set of notes you can review afterwards. You'll also want to assemble a set of lesson plans for all the maneuvers and all the required ground topics you'll have to teach to a student pilot. Later, I'd also suggest that you practice teaching these lessons to anyone you can get to sit down long enough to listen to you. And it could even be a non-pilot family member. Those people are usually the most patient. That will give you good practice teaching the topics to people, and having done it a number of times makes it really easy to then teach that same lesson to the check ride examiner. Now, in terms of time allotment, I would expect to spend much more time doing self-study than flying or working with your instructor. I'm thinking the ratio could easily be 10 to 1, 10 hours of self-study per hour that you spend with a CFI practicing for the check ride. You'll find that doing tons of self-study will give you an excellent return on investment, as self-study doesn't cost anything, and you're going to then spend fewer hours prepping with a CFI if you're already incredibly knowledgeable about everything. So keep at it. Jimmy, it's going to be the most work you've ever done for a check ride, but passing that check ride will be one of the greatest satisfactions you will ever have as a pilot. And stay in touch and let us know how it goes. And that's all the time we have for questions this week. If you have a question you'd like me to answer on the show, please go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Listener Question at the top so you can record your question, which I'll play on the show. Or if you want to send an email, go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. I would love to hear from you about anything. And please make a list of all your friends who might enjoy Aviation News Talk, and then share this episode with them. The app you're listening to probably has something you can click on to directly share this episode with a friend by email. Or for your non-techie friends, tell them to look for Aviation News Talk app for iPhones and iPads in the App Store. And if you think someday you might buy a new or slightly used Cirrus, give me a call. I can help arrange a free demo flight if you're thinking about a new Cirrus, and also help you understand the trade-offs between both new and used Cirrus aircraft. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the country. Until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. Provide advisory vertical guidance. Oh, God.